In the scorching summer of 1997, the quiet desert community surrounding Goldfield was unsettled by the vanishing of two young sisters. Amy and Beth Cooper had disappeared without a trace during a family tour of the abandoned mining town, leaving behind only their matching yellow sun hats fluttering against the weathered boards of the old saloon. But 27 years later, when an archaeological team stumbled upon a hidden chamber beneath the ghost town, they would uncover a truth so horrifying it would unravel the very fabric of what the world believed about evil and lead to the most chilling revelation imaginable. The morning had begun with such promise. David Cooper adjusted his camera strap as he walked beside his wife Sarah, watching their 10-year-old twins skip ahead on the dusty path between crumbling buildings. Amy's braids bounced with each step, while Beth clutched a small disposable camera, documenting everything that caught her curious eye. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, but the family had come prepared with wide-brimmed hats and plenty of water. "Stay close, girls," Sarah called, her voice carrying easily in the thin air. The ghost town stretched before them like a movie set frozen in time, false-fronted buildings leaning at precarious angles, their paint long since scoured away by decades of sandstorms. Windows stared out like hollow eyes, some still holding fragments of glass that caught the light like scattered diamonds. Beth raised her camera toward the old saloon, its double doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. "Mom, can we go inside? Just for a minute?" Sarah replied, checking her watch. They were running ahead of schedule, and the tour guide had mentioned the saloon's original bar was still intact. David pushed open one of the doors, and it groaned on its hinges like something in pain. The interior was cooler, filled with shadows and the musty scent of old wood and forgotten time. Amy ran her fingers along the bar's scarred surface, while Beth continued taking pictures the camera's flash, briefly illuminating corners where dust motes danced like tiny spirits. "Look at this!"
"Look at this!"
Amy called, from near a back corner, her voice echoing strangely in the empty space. That was the last anyone heard from the Cooper twins. When their parents turned to look, both girls were gone, as if the desert itself had swallowed them whole. Only their matching sun hats remained found hours later, by the saloon's entrance abandoned and still warm from the merciless sun. The search began within an hour of the discovery. Desert winds howled through Goldfield's broken windows as dozens of volunteers combed through every building, their voices calling the twins' names until their throats grew raw. Sheriff's deputies arrived from 3 counties, their radios crackling with coordinates and descriptions, while search dogs sniffed frantically at the yellow sun. Hats whining as the scent trails seemed to simply end. 3 days into the investigation, Detective Maria Santos sat across from Helen Cross in the climate-controlled quiet of the Desert Heritage Museum. The curator's office smelled of old paper and lavender hand cream, a stark contrast to the grit and desperation that had consumed Goldfield. Helen's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea from a ceramic pot painted with delicate wildflowers. "I keep thinking about them," Helen said, her voice soft, with what seemed like genuine anguish. "Those sweet little girls." When Mr. Cooper called asking about historical sites suitable for children, I immediately thought of Goldfield. It's educational, relatively safe, and the buildings are stable enough for exploration. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "If I'd known." Detective Santos studied the woman across from her. Helen Cross appeared to be in her late 50s, with greying hair, pulled back in a practical bun, and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified pale blue eyes. She wore a cardigan despite the heat, and her desk was meticulously organised. Stacks of research papers, aligned perfectly, pens arranged by colour, a small cactus in a hand-painted pot positioned precisely in the corner. "You provided them with maps?" Santos asked, consulting her notepad. "Of course. I always do. Helen reached into a desk drawer and withdrew a manila folder. I keep copies of everything I give to families. The historical overview safety guidelines suggested routes through the town. She spread the papers across her desk with practiced efficiency. I even marked the most interesting buildings, the saloon, the general store, the old assay office. Santos noticed Helen's handwriting was remarkably precise, each letter formed with careful attention to detail. The maps showed not just the main streets, but also smaller paths, side buildings, even what appeared to be ventilation shafts from the old mines. More detail than most tourists would ever need. "You've been recommending Goldfield for how long?" Santos asked. Helen's eyes took on a distant quality. "Oh, years now. It's such a perfect example of boom and bust mining culture. Families always leave feeling they've truly experienced history." She smiled, but something in the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "I do hope those precious girls are found soon." Detective Santos closed her notepad and drove back toward Goldfield, where the investigation had shifted focus to 3 men whose presence during the Cooper family's visit could not be ignored. The desert heat shimmered off the asphalt as she considered each suspect, their motivations swirling in her mind like the dust devils that danced across the barren landscape. Jake Butler sat in handcuffs in the back of a patrol car, his tour guide uniform wrinkled and stained with sweat. At 34, he possessed the kind of weathered face that spoke of too many years under the desert sun and too many nights in questionable establishments. His termination from Desert Adventure Tours 3 weeks prior had been swift and decisive. Inappropriate comments to a 13-year-old girl on a family excursion witnessed by multiple tourists and reported immediately. "I never touched nobody," Butler insisted for the 4th time, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man whose world was collapsing. "Yeah, I was there that day doing my own thing exploring. But I got rights to be in Goldfield.
What do you want?"
Same as anybody." His alibi crumbled under scrutiny. He claimed to have been photographing mining equipment near the stamp mill, but no such photographs existed on his camera. 50 yards away, Robert Torres paced beside his expensive SUV, his designer shirt soaked through with perspiration that had nothing to do with the heat. As heir to Torres Mining Enterprises, he should have been worth millions. Instead, lawsuits over contaminated groundwater had drained the family fortune, and creditors circled like vultures. Witnesses reported seeing him arguing with someone on his cell phone near the old company office building just hours before the twins disappeared. "Those people have no right being here," Torres had told the responding officers, gesturing wildly at the crime scene tape. "This is still Torres land, technically. My grandfather built half these buildings." His behavior grew increasingly erratic as questioning continued. One moment cooperative, the next demanding everyone leave his property immediately. The third man, Mike Webb, had been discovered with a metal detector near the cemetery at the town's edge, claiming to search for historical artifacts. Local authorities knew him well. He'd been caught twice selling stolen Native American pottery to collectors, and his van contained suspicious modifications, including soundproofing material and restraints he claimed were for securing antique furniture. Webb's notebook contained detailed observations about visiting families, including physical descriptions of children and notes about their parents' supervision habits. Most disturbing was an entry dated 2 days before the Coopers' visit. "New family coming Tuesday. Curator lady says twins around 10. Check usual spots." Santos felt the familiar chill that came with staring into genuine malice. The investigation into Jake Butler's background revealed a pattern that made seasoned detectives' skin crawl. Over the past 5 years, 4 separate families had filed complaints about his conduct during ghost town tours. None had pressed charges. The incidents were always just inappropriate enough to be disturbing, but not quite criminal. Suggestive comments masked as historical facts, unnecessary physical contact, disguised as assistance, and an unsettling habit of separating children from their parents to show them special locations. Detective Santos reviewed the files in her makeshift command post, a folding table set up in the shade of Goldfield's old post office. The building's interior temperature had dropped as evening approached, but the walls still radiated heat like the inside of an oven. Somewhere in the distance, David and Sarah Cooper continued their methodical search through buildings they'd already examined twice, their voices hoarse from calling their daughters' names. Butler's employment history painted the picture of a drifter who gravitated toward jobs that provided access to children. Before the tour company, he'd worked at a summer camp in Colorado, fired after 3 weeks for taking unauthorized photographs of campers. Prior to that, a brief stint as a school janitor in Nevada ended when a teacher reported finding him lingering outside the girls' restroom during lunch periods. "He knows these buildings better than anybody," Sheriff Wade Morrison said, joining Santos at her improvised desk. The man's face showed the strain of 3 sleepless days' deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much over his 40-year career. "Butler's been guiding tours here for 2 years. He knows every hiding place, every old mine shaft, every cellar." The tour company's records showed Butler had specifically requested the Goldfield route, despite other guides having seniority. His supervisor noted that Butler seemed unusually interested in families with young children, often volunteering to take those tours, even when assigned to different routes. Most troubling was a logbook entry from 6 months earlier. Jake asked again about underground access points, told him tours don't go below ground level, seemed disappointed. As darkness fell across the desert, portable floodlights illuminated the search areas, casting harsh shadows between the buildings. Moths fluttered frantically around the bright bulbs, while somewhere in the distance, a coyote's howl echoed off the rocky hills. Sarah Cooper emerged from the old general store, tears streaming down her dust-covered face as she clutched one of Beth's hair ribbons found caught on a nail inside a storage closet. The evidence against Butler seemed overwhelming. His presence, his history, his knowledge of the terrain, every logical thread pointed toward him as the twins' abductor. But Santos couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was missing, some detail that would make the puzzle complete. Robert Torres' financial records told a story of spectacular collapse that transformed a mining dynasty into a desperate man's last stand. By dawn of the 4th day, forensic accountants had painted a clear picture. Torres Mining Enterprises owed $7 million in environmental cleanup costs, and the family's personal assets had been liquidated to pay legal fees. The company that once employed half of Nevada's silver miners now existed only on paper, its equipment sold at auction, and its legacy reduced to contaminated soil reports. Detective Santos found Torres in the abandoned company headquarters, a 2-story building that had once been Goldfield's seat of power. He sat behind his grandfather's mahogany desk, which someone had dragged back into the gutted office despite the building lacking electricity or running water. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight, streaming through broken windows, and the floor was littered with torn legal documents and empty whiskey bottles. "They want to take everything," Torres muttered, not looking up when Santos entered. His expensive clothes were now rumpled and stained, his carefully maintained appearance dissolved into something feral. 90 years my family worked this land. 90 years, and they want to erase us like we never existed. The lawsuits were crushing him systematically. Groundwater contamination from old mining operations had poisoned 3 residential wells, and the affected families were demanding damages that would bankrupt Torres completely. His lawyers had abandoned him when the retainer checks started bouncing, and his wife had filed for divorce the previous month, taking their children to her mother's house in California. "You were seen arguing near the old assay office," Santos said, settling into a chair that had somehow survived the building's decay. The same afternoon, the Cooper girls disappeared. Torres laughed, but the sound held no humour. Insurance company. Trying to tell me I can't collect on the fire policy because the buildings are abandoned. My grandfather built those structures to last a century, and now they're calling them worthless. He gestured toward the broken windows. You know what desperate men do, detective. Strange sounds had been reported echoing from the old mine shafts since the twins' disappearance. Metallic scraping, muffled thud sounds that could be machinery or could be something else entirely. Torres had keys to the mining equipment still stored in underground chambers, industrial tools capable of moving earth or concealing evidence. His knowledge of the mine system was encyclopedic, passed down through 3 generations of Torres men. A ransom note would make sense from his perspective. The Cooper family appeared affluent, travelling from out of state, with expensive camera equipment and designer clothing. But no demands had come. No contact from potential kidnappers. Santos watched Torres's hands as he spoke. They were scraped and dirty fingernails caked with desert soil, as if he'd been digging. Mike Webb's modified van sat in the sheriff's impound lot, like a predator caught in a cage. The vehicle's exterior appeared normal enough. Faded blue paint Nevada plates, a dented rear bumper held in place with duct tape. But inside, investigators had discovered a mobile hunting blind designed for human prey. Soundproofing foam covered the walls. Restraints were bolted to the floor, and a collection of children's toys filled a locked storage compartment beneath the passenger seat. Detective Santos walked around the van, with the crime scene photographer documenting every disturbing detail. Webb claimed the restraints were for securing antique furniture during transport, but the positioning told a different story. They were sized for small bodies installed at child height with padding that suggested long-term use rather than temporary cargo restraint. Webb himself sat in the interrogation room, his thin frame hunched over a table scarred with decades of desperate confessions and half-truths. At 47, he possessed the pale, soft appearance of someone who spent too much time indoors studying catalogues and planning acquisitions. His arrest record stretched back 15 years. Theft of archaeological artefacts, trespassing on protected lands, selling stolen Native American pottery to private collectors who asked no questions. I observe families for legitimate business purposes. Webb insisted, his voice carrying the practiced patience of someone accustomed to dealing with authorities. Tourists drop things, lose jewelry, leave valuable items behind. I'm providing a recovery service, but his notebook revealed something far more sinister. Page after page contained detailed observations about visiting families, which parents were attentive, which children wandered away from supervision, which families carried expensive equipment worth stealing. Most entries included physical descriptions of children with disturbing specificity. Hair color approximate height clothing, preferences, behavioral patterns. Santos read aloud from an entry dated 1 week before the Cooper visit. Family from Phoenix, 2 boys, maybe 8 and 10. Father distracted by camera equipment, mother reading guidebook. Boys played near old mine entrance for 20 minutes unobserved. Another entry from 3 months earlier. Single mother with daughter, probably 12. Daughter very independent, explored buildings alone while mother rested in shade. The curator lady reference appeared in 17 different entries over the past 2 years. Someone at the Desert Heritage Museum was providing Webb with advance information about visiting families, their composition, their planned routes, their schedules. But when pressed for details, Webb became evasive, claiming he couldn't remember exactly who gave him the information. "She's just helpful," Webb said, fidgeting with his hands. "Nice lady. Sometimes mentions families coming through, just friendly conversation." As evidence mounted against him, Webb's behaviour grew increasingly strange. He seemed genuinely confused about certain details, as if someone else had been directing his actions. When shown photographs of the Cooper twins, his face went blank for several seconds before he started crying, not the tears of guilt, but the helpless sobs of someone who realised he'd been used. 27 years passed like wind across desert stone, eroding the sharp edges of memory, until the Cooper twins became another ghost story whispered around Goldfield's crumbling buildings. Jake Butler died in prison 3 years after his conviction for child endangerment, a different case, a different victim, but the pattern held true. Robert Torres lost his final appeal and spent his last decade in a state mental facility, mumbling about family honour to visitors who never came. Mike Webb served 18 months for trafficking stolen artefacts, then disappeared into the anonymous sprawl of Las Vegas. Another broken man swallowed by the desert's indifference. The case files gathered dust in storage boxes officially closed but never truly solved. David and Sarah Cooper divorced 2 years after the disappearance, their marriage, another casualty of loss too profound for healing. The town itself seemed to settle deeper into decay, as if the weight of unanswered questions had accelerated its inevitable collapse. Dr. Jennifer Reeves pulled her university-issued truck to a stop beside Goldfield's old assay office, the building's wooden walls bleached white by decades of relentless sun. At 32, she possessed the methodical patience that made her an excellent field archaeologist, and the optimism necessary to see historical significance in ruins others dismissed as debris. Her team from Nevada State University had come to document the mining era's industrial infrastructure before the site was finally abandoned to the elements. GPS coordinates match the old mine entrance, called Marcus Chen, her graduate assistant, as he unloaded ground-penetrating radar equipment from the truck bed. The device would map subsurface structures revealing the extent of underground workings that had once made Goldfield one of the West's most productive silver mining operations. The morning air carried the familiar scent of sage and dust, but something else lingered beneath a faint sweetness that seemed out of place in the desert's harsh environment. Jennifer noticed it immediately, her trained senses alert to anomalies that might indicate organic preservation in unexpected locations. "Professor, you need to see this," Marcus said, studying the radar screen with a puzzled expression. The device showed a large underground chamber approximately 30 feet beneath the surface, far too extensive and geometrically precise to be a natural formation. More puzzling were the metallic signatures scattered throughout the space objects that shouldn't exist in an abandoned mining operation. Jennifer knelt beside the radar unit, watching as the underground structure took shape on the digital display. The chamber appeared to be accessed through a concealed entrance, its walls showing the straight lines and right angles of intentional construction. Someone had built something down there, something meant to remain hidden from the casual exploration that brought tourists and treasure hunters to Goldfield's surface ruins. The sweetness in the air grew stronger as a breeze shifted, carrying with it the whisper of secrets buried too long in darkness. The entrance revealed itself 3 hours later, concealed beneath a false floor in the old assay office's basement. Jennifer's team had followed the radar signatures with systematic precision, removing decades of accumulated debris until Marcus's shovel struck something that rang like metal rather than stone. The trapdoor was steel painted to match the surrounding concrete and fitted with hinges that showed signs of regular use despite their hidden location. "This isn't from the mining era," Jennifer said, examining the modern lock mechanism. The metal showed no rust, despite the desert's corrosive minerals, suggesting recent maintenance. More disturbing was the presence of fresh scratches around the lock. Someone had been accessing this chamber within the past few years. The lock yielded to bolt cutters, and the heavy door opened on silent hinges to reveal a ladder descending into absolute darkness. The sweet smell that had haunted the morning air now rose from the opening like incense from some unholy altar, accompanied by the mustiness of preserved organic material. And something else, the lingering scent of fear, absorbed into stone. Jennifer descended first, her headlamp cutting through shadows that seemed to resist illumination. The chamber was larger than the radar had indicated, its walls carved from solid rock and lined with what appeared to be ritual symbols, pentagrams, inverted crosses, and geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The floor was smooth concrete, recently poured and meticulously maintained. But it was the contents that stopped her breath in her throat. Children's belongings filled wooden shelves that lined the chamber's perimeter, shoes, arranged by size clothing folded with obsessive care toys, positioned with the precision of museum displays. Each item bore a small card with dates spanning 40 years. Timothy Morrison, age 6 August 1983. Lisa Chen, age 8 March 1991. Michael Stewart, age 9 October 2005. In the chamber's centre sat 3 stone altars, their surfaces stained dark with substances Jennifer's training couldn't allow her to identify. Photographs covered the walls between the shelves. Dozens of children's faces smiling with the innocence of family vacations, school portraits, playground moments. The images were arranged in chronological order, documenting decades of systematic predation. Marcus emerged from behind one of the altars, his face pale in the artificial light. "Professor," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. "There's more. Personal items, cameras, jewelry, some of this stuff." He held up a small yellow sun hat, its fabric still bright after 27 years of preservation in the climate-controlled chamber. Jennifer recognized it immediately from the old case files she'd studied during her research into Goldfield's history. Amy Cooper's hat, placed with reverent care among trophies that represented decades of unthinkable evil. The discovery of the twins' belongings led to a more thorough search of the chamber's darkest corners. Jennifer's team worked in stunned silence, cataloguing evidence that would rewrite the history of missing children cases across 3 states. Each shelf revealed new horrors. School backpacks, arranged by decade tricycles, positioned like silent sentinels. Even a wooden rocking horse whose paint had been lovingly maintained, despite years of underground storage. The preservation is incredible. Marcus observed his scientific training, warring with human revulsion as he documented the scene. The chamber's temperature remained constant, the humidity controlled by a sophisticated ventilation system that drew air through hidden ducts connecting to the surface buildings. Someone had invested considerable time and money creating the perfect environment for their collection. Jennifer found Beth Cooper's disposable camera in a place of honor positioned on a small pedestal near the chamber's eastern wall. The device sat beneath a glass dome like a museum piece, protected from dust and decay with the same meticulous care shown to every item in the underground shrine. Beside it lay Amy's identical camera, the twin devices reunited in this temple to childhood's violent end. The camera's placement suggested special significance to their collector. Unlike other items scattered throughout the chamber, these occupied a dedicated display area, surrounded by candles that had been lit recently. The wax pooled in fresh formations, and the sweet scent that permeated the space seemed strongest here. Photographs of the Cooper twins covered the wall behind the pedestal images, ranging from school portraits to candid shots that could only have been taken by someone with intimate access to the family. "How did someone get photos of them at home?" Marcus asked, studying pictures that showed the twins in their bedroom playing in their backyard, walking to school. The photographs suggested months of surveillance-detailed preparation for what would become their final day. Jennifer carefully removed the cameras from their shrine, her hands trembling despite her professional composure. The film inside had been developed and reprinted, the original negatives preserved in archival sleeves that showed the same obsessive attention to detail evident throughout the chamber. Someone had studied these images extensively, analysing every frame like a scholar examining sacred texts. The first camera contained typical tourist shots, the Cooper family posing beside Goldfield's welcome sign, the twins exploring the general store, Sarah and David examining mining equipment. Normal vacation memories that made the final images even more disturbing by contrast. The last several frames on Beth's camera showed a dramatic change in perspective and subject matter. The angles became erratic, suggesting the camera had been grabbed or knocked away during some kind of struggle. But it was the final photograph that caused Jennifer's blood to freeze in her veins, a clear image of a woman's face captured in the moment she was reaching for the camera with gloved hands. The face in the photograph belonged to Helen Cross. Jennifer stared at the image with the kind of disbelief that accompanies impossible revelations. The woman who had recommended the Goldfield tour to the Cooper family, who had provided them with detailed maps, who had expressed such genuine concern during the investigation, she was there in Beth's final photograph, her pale blue eyes magnified behind wire-rimmed glasses as she reached toward the camera with latex-gloved hands. The curator's expression in the photo was nothing like the gentle concern she had shown Detective Santos 27 years earlier. Her face held the focused intensity of a scientist conducting an experiment, clinical and detached as she moved to silence the small witness to her work. The cardigan was the same style she'd worn in her office, and her greying hair was pulled back in the same practical bun, but the woman in the photograph was a predator caught in the act of claiming prey. Marcus examined the print with a magnifying glass, his voice hollow with recognition. "I know her. She's still at the museum. Dr. Cross gave a lecture to our department last semester about preserving historical artifacts." He looked up at Jennifer with dawning horror. "She talked about the importance of controlling environmental conditions, maintaining perfect preservation for future study." The chamber suddenly felt smaller, its walls pressing inward as the full implications became clear. Helen Cross hadn't just recommended the Goldfield tour, she had orchestrated it. The detailed maps she'd provided weren't meant to help the family explore the ghost town's history, but to guide them toward this underground tomb where she could add them to her collection. Jennifer's mind raced through the evidence scattered throughout the chamber. The sophisticated preservation system, the meticulous cataloguing, the reverent display of personal items. Everything reflected the methodology of a trained curator. Someone with institutional knowledge of conservation techniques, someone with access to professional-grade equipment, someone trusted enough to recommend family destinations without arousing suspicion. The photographs on the walls took on new meaning as Jennifer examined them with fresh understanding. Many showed children in settings that suggested the photographer had been welcomed as a family friend or helpful stranger. Birthday parties where an extra adult presence wouldn't seem unusual. School events where a community member might volunteer to help family outings where a knowledgeable local could offer guidance and assistance. Helen Cross had been hunting for decades, using her position at the Desert Heritage Museum as both cover and hunting ground. Parents seeking educational activities for their children would naturally trust a professional curator's recommendations, especially one who seemed so genuinely invested in sharing historical knowledge with young minds. The investigation into Helen Cross's decades-long pattern began with a single phone call to the Desert Heritage Museum. Dr. Margaret Winters, who had replaced Cross as curator following her arrest, found herself walking through filing cabinets that contained 40 years of meticulous record-keeping. Each folder represented a family contact, and every family contact included detailed notes about visiting children, their ages, interests, family dynamics, and planned destinations. She kept everything. Dr. Winters told the FBI task force that had taken over the case. The museum's basement storage area contained boxes of correspondence with families from across the western United States, each letter offering helpful suggestions for historical tourism with their children. Cross had developed a network of contacts at small museums, historical societies and visitor centres, all feeding her information about travelling families. The scope of her operation was staggering. Computer records showed that Cross had recommended isolated historical sites to over 300 families during her tenure, always focusing on locations where children might become separated from their parents. Ghost towns, abandoned mining settlements, remote archaeological sites, places where a helpful curator's detailed knowledge would be invaluable and where screams wouldn't carry beyond empty buildings and desert winds. Agent Rachel Morrison, no relation to the former sheriff, reviewed Cross's employment history with growing horror. The woman had worked at 4 different museums over the past 45 years, moving every decade or so to new hunting grounds when local missing children cases attracted too much attention. Each position had been obtained through glowing recommendations that praised her dedication to education and her special gift for connecting with young visitors. She was hired specifically for her work with children. Morrison noted reading personnel files from Cross's previous employers. Every museum director mentions how the kids loved her tours, how she had this amazing ability to make history come alive for young minds. The words now carried a sinister double meaning that made the agent's skin crawl. Cross's personal apartment, searched after her arrest, revealed the full extent of her scholarly approach to predation. Academic journals on child psychology filled her bookshelves alongside research papers on forensic preservation techniques and studies of family behavioural patterns during recreational travel. She had approached hunting children with the same methodical precision she brought to curating historical artefacts. A locked desk drawer contained what Cross called her field notes, detailed behavioural observations of families who visited the museum, including sketched floor plans of remote destinations and calculations about optimal timing for abductions. The notes revealed a woman who studied her victims like specimens, analysing their habits and vulnerabilities with clinical detachment before making her recommendations. The final entry in her journal, dated just 1 week before the archaeological team's discovery, read, "Underground preservation chamber maintaining optimal conditions. Collection complete but ready for expansion when suitable subjects present themselves." The investigation into Helen Cross's decades-long pattern began with a single phone call to the Desert Heritage Museum. Dr. Margaret Winters, who had replaced Cross as curator following her arrest, found herself walking through filing cabinets that contained 40 years of meticulous record-keeping. Each folder represented a family contact, and every family contact included detailed notes about visiting children their ages, interests, family dynamics, and planned destinations. She kept everything, Dr. Winters told the FBI task force that had taken over the case. The museum's basement storage area contained boxes of correspondence with families from across the western United States, each letter offering helpful suggestions for historical tourism with their children. Cross had developed a network of contacts at small museums, historical societies, and visitor centres, all feeding her information about travelling families. The scope of her operation was staggering. Computer records showed that Cross had recommended isolated historical sites to over 300 families during her tenure, always focusing on locations where children might become separated from their parents. Ghost towns, abandoned mining settlements, remote archaeological sites, places where a helpful curator's detailed knowledge would be invaluable, and where screams wouldn't carry beyond empty buildings and desert winds. Agent Rachel Morrison reviewed Cross's employment history with growing horror. The woman had worked at 4 different museums over the past 45 years, moving every decade or so to new hunting grounds when local missing children cases attracted too much attention. Each position had been obtained through glowing recommendations that praised her dedication to education and her special gift for connecting with young visitors. She was hired specifically for her work with children, Morrison noted, reading personnel files from Cross's previous employers. Every museum director mentions how the kids loved her tours, how she had this amazing ability to make history come alive for young minds. The words now carried a sinister double meaning that made the agent's skin crawl. Cross's personal apartment, searched after her arrest, revealed the full extent of her scholarly approach to predation. Academic journals on child psychology filled her bookshelves alongside research papers on forensic preservation techniques and studies of family behavioural patterns during recreational travel. She had approached hunting children with the same methodical precision she brought to curating historical artefacts. A locked desk drawer contained what Cross called her field notes, detailed behavioural observations of families who visited the museum, including sketched floor plans of remote destinations and calculations about optimal timing for abductions. The notes revealed a woman who studied her victims like specimens, analysing their habits and vulnerabilities with clinical detachment before making her recommendations. The final entry in her journal, dated just 1 week before the archaeological team's discovery, read, "Underground preservation chamber maintaining optimal conditions. Collection complete but ready for expansion when suitable subjects present themselves." So, Helen Cross sat in the federal courthouse wearing the same style of cardigan she had favoured for decades, her wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the fluorescent lights as the judge read her sentence. 43 counts of first-degree murder spanning 4 decades and 3 states. The families of her victims filled the courtroom's gallery, some grey-haired grandparents who had spent lifetimes searching for children who would never come home. Others middle-aged parents who had built lives around the hollow space where their sons and daughters should have been. Dr. Jennifer Reeves watched from the witness section, her testimony having helped prosecutors connect decades of missing children cases to the woman who had hidden behind academic credentials and community trust. The underground chamber had yielded DNA evidence from 37 different victims, transforming cold cases into a prosecutorial roadmap that stretched from California to Colorado. The defendant used her position of trust and expertise to systematically prey upon families seeking educational experiences for their children. The judge stated, his voice carrying the weight of institutional betrayal that made Cross's crimes particularly heinous. She exploited the natural inclination of parents to seek guidance from knowledgeable professionals, turning that trust into a weapon against the most innocent among us. Cross showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The same clinical detachment she had applied to her victims now served as armor against the consequences of her actions. She had approached evil with scholarly precision, and she faced justice with the same academic distance. Sarah Cooper, now 63 and accompanied by her adult son, born years after the twins' disappearance, stood outside the courthouse as reporters gathered for statements. The decades had carved deep lines around her eyes, but her voice remained steady as she spoke about closure and the strange relief of finally knowing what had happened to Amy and Beth. "She seemed so helpful," Sarah said, echoing the sentiments of dozens of other families. "So concerned about giving our children a meaningful experience. That's what made it so perfect. Who questions a museum curator's recommendation?" As the crowd dispersed, Jennifer looked back at the courthouse one last time. The real journey was just beginning for the families who could finally grieve properly, who could transform decades of wondering into the difficult work of healing. In the end, that was the lesson: evil might hide behind familiar faces and trusted institutions, but truth endures even when buried beneath desert stone. As she walked toward her car, Jennifer squeezed her research partner's hand. "How do we trust anyone again?" she whispered. "One day at a time," he replied. "One day at a time." They stepped toward healing, toward a future they would build one day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.